All right, well, just want to thank you for coming. I'm Rodney, this is Nolan. Yeah, thanks for coming. We're happy to be here. Like Katie said, we are just kind of finishing up a vacation and getting ready to head back home. So, but it's good to be here. So this is the Farwell ditch is something we've been working on the past 3 years, I think.
Yeah, 3-4 years.
And it's been it's kind of started out with David and Judy Zahner helping us learn more about it, and it's been great. So I don't know if you want to say anything. We've got a slideshow we'll go through, and we're not public speakers, so feel free to ask questions, and it'll be pretty laid back. So
yeah, that'll help. If you want to interrupt with a question, feel free. That'll be better than us reading off our slides, but we'll do our best. So I guess we'll just get off and running here.
Where do you guys live now?
So I'm from Sabetha, Kansas. It's about 11 hours from here, probably.
And I'm in Cedar Falls, Iowa. So I guess that's a good question for this slide. So who are we? My family, my wife and kids and I are on the right. That's me, my wife Katie, my oldest son Blake, who's here, if you want to raise your hand, my daughter Brenna, daughter Adrian, and my youngest son Jace, if he wants to, he's in the back. Sitting next to my dad, Terry Farwell. So Grandpa's with us. And then Routt, if you want to introduce your family.
Yeah, so so my wife Leanne, my oldest son Kenton. You want to raise your hand? Okay, then Addison, she's not here because it's a guy's trip. And then Dean, you want to raise your hand? And then my youngest Evan, right there. So we grew up in Northeast Kansas, and so yeah, that's where we're from.
Yep, Terry in the back, our dad. He was born and raised on a farm. We were born and raised on a farm. His ancestors were farmers. I'm the one that moved off, I guess. So I live in Cedar Falls, Iowa now. Still in the Midwest, so I'm heading back there over the next couple of days. But so the Farwell ditch, how did we get involved? It all kind of started for our family 8 years ago. My wife and kids, my wife and I, were trying to figure out a summer vacation. My boss at the time had a timeshare and said, "Hey, I've got open time I'm not going to use. Do you want to use it?" Sure. So we looked around, and we were kind of late planning it. One of the only places that had availability, Steamboat Springs, Colorado. So we decided we're going to Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and came out here. Spent a week or so. One of the days we decided to go up north to Steamboat Lake just to hike around and whatnot, and went into the visitor center, and all over the walls and a big 3D topographic map, we see references to Farwell in there, which, you know, it's not a common name. It kind of piques my interest. And then, Farwell Mountain, that's even better. And so that, just got my wheels turning. And came home, got on Google, and turns out that there's a whole lot of history here from a guy named John B. Farwell back in the 1870s, who was somebody, quite honestly, I'd never even heard of. So read about him. He was, we'll get into who he was later. So that was 2014. Fast forward a couple years, largely this group that's here today, minus a couple of the younger boys, came out here on our first guys trip. And we rode ATVs around on all the Forest Service trails and had a blast, and it's kind of become an annual tradition for us. It's something we all love to do. That's 2016. The next few years, we knew some of the mining history. It was always kind of in the back of our head, and it just kind of progressed. We need to learn more about that. And I started, in the Farwell ditch, we'd read about, but there's just not a lot of information online about it. And so I started making some phone calls. Shredded Pioneers was one of the calls I made. I think I called the museum over in Hayden or Craig, there's a museum. The final call I made was up to the Hans Peak Museum, historic Hans Peak. And Marge Eardley answered the phone. She's not here today, I wish she was. But Marge answered the phone. I didn't know who she was at the time, but I told her my name and just asked, is there anybody around, or do you have information about the old Farwell ditch that was constructed? And Marge said, I do not, but I know the guy you need to talk to. His name's David Zahner, and she gave me his phone number, and I called David, and we had a good conversation, and David's here today, and his wife Judy. David offered very generously to take Rodney, me, and Terry, our dad, in the back. David had done some hiking. I believe, I'm getting my story straight, he has a background in road building, earth moving, and just noticed over time up in Hans Peak Village area grades in the terrain that were man-made grades, and knew that just, that type of line in the ground doesn't occur naturally because it's very flat. So he did some, before we were ever around, he had done some research and homework and figured out this was the old ditch that was built back in the day. And so he started sharing his knowledge with us. Our first time out to meet him was in 2019, 3 years ago. And he took us in his Jeep and showed us a chunk of the ditch, including a tunnel that had been built that's part of it. So that was very valuable information, and we owe David and Judy just very thankful for them and their friendship. They're like family now to us. So I'm getting off topic. That's 2019. And then 2020 to current, it's just continued efforts to learn more, research more. We've done our best. David had taken paper topographic maps and a yellow highlighter, and to the best of his knowledge mapped where the ditch was. We took those papers and plotted it in Google Earth so that we have a digital plot roughly of where the ditch lies. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. So we've done that. Let's see, 2 years ago, Rodney and I and our wives, we had found in an old geologic reference book online, I think from the 1960s, that's all about northern Routt County, reference to a second tunnel, 1 point something miles east-southeast of Farwell Lake. I can plot generally where that is. That year, 2020, Rodney and I and our wives decided we're going to go try to find that. And we did. It's there, it exists. And so we uncovered that tunnel. Last year we went back to it. David went along. A couple others went along as well. Terry in the back went with us. Our sister Dana. And then one of David's neighbors, Josh Inc. up in Hans Peak Village, went along with us as well. So that was last year. This year, a lot of people worked really hard to pursue a local historic designation. I'm probably not saying that right, what the title is, but Routt County Historic Designation for the ditch itself. Arianthi was very instrumental in that, thank you very much. Did a lot of work in the application and presenting it to the local Historic Routt County Board and the county commissioners, all of whom seemed to be very enthusiastic about the project and approved it for designation locally. So that happened, I think, in March, earlier this year. That's probably enough me rambling on this slide.
Well, and like Nolan said, there's very little information out there about the Farwell ditch. You can get online and Google it, and there's just little bits and pieces out there in old newspaper articles, but it doesn't all match up. So we feel like it's almost history that was lost. So I think it was pretty close to happening. So that's why we've kind of become passionate about it, and we're to the point where to learn more, we kind of just got to go out and look ourselves. So that's what we're trying to do. It's hard to do when we live so far away, but every year we're going to try to keep doing it. But so what is the Farwell ditch? It's a 17 mile, originally 17 miles long. It was later extended to 18 miles. It was hand dug with shovels and picks and dynamite. Started at Trail Creek, which is the the headwaters of the Elk River, and originally ended in Ways Gulch at Farwell's mining operation. After Farwell left, Robert McIntosh, which was somebody that Farwell brought with him from Chicago, and McIntosh actually supervised the building of the ditch. But anyway, he took over the mine, he extended it another mile, and ended up having good success. The construction of the ditch represents the shift from simple low-cost placer mining by individuals on their own claims to the more consolidated, capital-intensive, industrialized, and destructive hydraulic mining method. So before they had this, they didn't have a good way of having a big mining operation. It was just a lot of smaller mines that weren't, you couldn't get a lot done, I guess. And this bringing water in, water is what they needed to do this, so this is how they made it happen. Obviously, total cost of $160,000 back in the day, that was huge back then. So over $5 million in today's dollars. Like I said, they needed water for the bigger mining operations, and there was no water rights. So that's kind of interesting in the time frame of this, is because it was. There's no water rights, there's no record of it or anything, because this was started right before or right at the same time Colorado was becoming a state. So, there's a lot of ditches up there that you can look up and they have water rights and such, but this one was before that. Any questions so far?
What did they mine up there?
They were looking for gold. Was the main thing. Yep. Go ahead.
All right. So John V. Farwell, born in New York, 1825. His family moved out to early Chicago back in his youth. Not the Chicago of today. It was the beginnings of Chicago. He became a young merchant. I think it was Marshall and Field is what the original company was called. He basically worked his way up. Started there, worked his way up, became a partner, eventually started his own firm, and it became one of the largest wholesale goods companies in the country. So very successful. The gold bug must have caught his interest, and in the 1870s, 1875, I believe, he ended up in northern Routt County pursuing the gold. His brother Charles Farwell was a United States Senator. John V. himself was part of the Electoral College that elected Abe Lincoln as president. That's pretty cool. Later in life, they would go on the state capitol building in Texas. They financed the construction of, they were behind that. In exchange for that project, they received, I think, over 3 million acres of land. So rather than cash, they took land, and it became the largest cattle ranch in the world. It's called the XIT Cattle Ranch, and that's a whole nother topic that you can search that online and read all day about that.
Question?
Yeah.
How is he related to you? Are you guys?
We'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that. It might be the next slide, actually. John V. himself, he was he had a very deep Christian faith. So with his success, he was an early leader in the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, I believe is what that stands for. Huge supporter of getting that off the ground. And if you've heard of Dwight Moody, one of the most famous evangelists, he was a huge financial supporter of Dwight Moody in Chicago. Moody Bible Institute is there now. So that's a small snippet of John V. Farwell. So are we related? Yes and no. So we technically are. If we go all the way back up, there was a Henry Farwell, born in England in early 1600. He was the one that came over on a boat to the new land across the Atlantic. Go down a couple generations, so it would have been his grandson, Joseph Farwell Jr. Had 2 sons, one Daniel, one Samuel. Daniel's line, you can follow down to John V. Farwell. Samuel's line goes all the way down. You see Rodney and I at the bottom, and then, you know, right above that's Terry in the back. So we are related, but it takes, you know, you have to go back up several generations, and then it would be a brother, and then going back down. So a cousin once removed kind of thing. I don't know. But so we are related, but it's pretty distant.
Okay, so John V. In Colorado, he started his mining operations in the area in the 1870s. I believe 1875 maybe was the first time that he came out here. His original camp was called Amelia, and then International Camp, and finally Bugtown, because the locals called Farwell and other executives Big Bugs, is what the rumor is. So this was the first wage-paying industrial complex in northwest Colorado, and probably on the western slope. Like Nolan said, he was a religious man. His camp included a chapel where the first church services in Routt County were held. There was no drinking or gambling allowed, and I remember reading that to do that type of things, they had to go to the Hans Peak village, I guess. There was some maybe saloons and stuff there, I'm not sure. His mining operations were located on String Ridge, and once again they needed the water for his mining operations. So that's kind of how he got started. Like I mentioned before, he brought Robert McIntosh with him from Chicago. McIntosh was a contractor and trusted associate of John V's. John V constructed a road from Laramie through Hog Park to the Hans Peak mining district, and I believe this is what he used to get a lot of his equipment in here. He brought in a sawmill from Rawlins, which supplied lumber to build the mine infrastructure in town. I can't remember exactly where that sawmill was located. Do you remember?
South side of Farwell Mountain somewhere, I believe.
Yeah. I believe there was a fire that kind of wiped out a lot of that stuff, and I think that's when that sawmill was probably wiped out too. But when Routt County was formed in 1877, the first Routt County post office was actually located in Farwell's International Camp, which his camp is. It's obviously not there anymore, and it was basically completely destroyed by a fire as well. We were actually, Judy and I and Nolan were talking about this last night. Big fire in 1878, but this camp was probably destroyed after that at some point. Farwell enlisted Robert McIntosh to oversee the construction of the 17-mile ditch. Like we said before, not many details are documented or available about the original construction of the ditch. Question?
Why do they call it international camp?
That's a good question.
Everywhere, or?
Do you know?
I don't know the
I'm
answer.
not sure.
I don't know that either.
And for extra credit, how about Bugtown?
Well, Bugtown, what the rumor was they called Farwell and the other kind of high up executives, they called them Big Bugs. So that's why they called it Bugtown.
Okay.
That's the rumor. I don't know if that's actually true or not.
Yeah.
That's correct. That's
Okay.
correct. It's in a book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. So starting in 1876, Farwell first came out in 75, so starting in 76, McIntosh supervised 100 to 200 men building the ditch with hand-picked shovels and dynamite. They were paid $5 to $7 per day. Now the people who were actually the laborers on this, there's conflicting reports on that too. I know somewhere it mentioned Chinese workers or immigrants, but I think it was probably, I don't think that was the case. I think it was just people that were needing a job, and this was the first, kind of industrial job available around here. So it only took 2 years to complete, which is pretty incredible. If you ever if you ever have seen it or ever get the chance, it's still, to this day, it just blows my mind how it's not just a simple ditch. The elevation was crucial, and they had a very slight, it was almost perfectly level, but just a very slight downhill grade. If they went too steep, it would have just washed it right out. And how they could figure that out back then, weaving through the mountains for 17 miles is just incredible. So, and 2 years is all it took. So, go ahead if you want.
Yeah, so it was, like we said a couple times, first wage-paying enterprise on the western slope, or in the western slope of Colorado, we believe. And so one thing we've heard, maybe Judy, you told us this, is the reason people were after wages is it was largely a barter society prior to that. And so they could trade grain or meat or whatever and live a life, but you can't pay your taxes with that. So it was crucial to earn a wage so they actually had dollars to pay taxes. Moving forward, String Ridge was, we'll have a map later that kind of outlines where some of these landmarks are located, but the String Ridge area is where John V. Farwell had his mining operations. He himself did not have success. There's rumors that when he was out exploring the idea of mining, that maybe some gold had been sprinkled on the ground to entice him into buying. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. That's a rumor we read. It isn't a book. Who knows? Salted the claims was the term. So fast forward another couple years, 1879, terrible forest fires up north. There were several miles of the ditch that included wood fluming, piping, things like that, and virtually all burned to the ground. And at that point, Farwell said, I've had enough. I'm going to cut my losses and move on. I have bigger things to move on to, like cattle ranches in Texas. And so he sold the mine to a bank in Rawlins, Wyoming. I'm skipping ahead, I guess. Ended up Leadville and Independence area near Aspen today. He has footprints there too. We haven't been there and explored that, but he had operations there as well. The Independence ghost town, he was involved with that, if you've ever been there. Robert McIntosh then, who we've mentioned a few times, he bought the mine from the bank up in Wyoming, extended the ditch 1 more mile to the Poverty Bar area, which is right outside of Hans Peak Village today. He actually had success mining. There was a McIntosh Bonanza, as it was termed, 1 year, just extremely successful, especially for that era. The amount of gold he pulled out of the ground and the profit was very high. Shortly after that, he sold out, moved up to Slater, Wyoming, where he operated a large horse ranch. And an interesting note on that, and Robert McIntosh, sidebar here, the museum has a collection about Robert McIntosh. He was a very influential man himself. When he had his horse ranch, it was a large operation. He reached out to the U.S. government proposing that he would supply the U.S. military with horses, and he would breed them, raise them, the proper breeds and all that, train them. Within 2 weeks of him sending a letter to the president, he had a response back from the president basically saying thanks but no thanks. But the museum here has the signed letter back from the president to Robert McIntosh in the collection here.
Question?
The Hans Peak Historic Society has one of the flumes, piece of the wooden flume wrap.
They do, yeah.
There's a whole mining exhibit up here at the Hans Peak Museum.
Yeah, that's true. There's some piping and some fluming up there at the Hans Peak Museum. That's pretty cool to look at too. I'm not sure what section of ditch that came from. A lot of the original fluming was square in shape, and later we came across a court case involving this ditch that describes a lot of this ditch in detail, and they have even described the fluming, how they built it, and how they supported it and stuff like that. But yeah, there is some pretty cool stuff up there. So I'm going to read a little bit, if I can see it on my phone here. So this was a letter written by, you can't read it there, it's too small, but J.B. Donaldson, which was one of John V.'s mine superintendents. And up top there it says International Camp, you can't read it. Hans Peak, Routt County, Colorado, September 10th, 1879. And I'm not exactly sure who this is written to. I think it might have been an Indian commissioner or agency or something. But it says, "Dear Sir, your favor of September 6th is received," which once again, this is 4 days later. So how they did that so fast back in the day is crazy. The forest fire that began near Sand Mountain early in May has been burning ever since and has finally culminated. After sweeping all that section of country in a grand attack on our mining property on String Ridge, sweeping all before it and causing us very serious expense to keep it out of this camp. Besides, it is now sweeping everything before it along the line of our 17-mile ditch, on which we have several miles of fluming. The fire is so hot and the smoke is so dense that we cannot reach many of our flumes to know at present how many of them are destroyed. If any are left, it will be nothing short of a miracle. Thousands of acres have been burned over, and who can say where it will stop? Our sawmill and timber, I think, may go unless we get rain or snow within the next 3 days. We keep men night and day battling it where we can, but man is almost powerless against such a destructive element when once set in motion. Frank Hinman asked the Utes when he was on Snake River why they set timber on fire in our section, and they replied, in order that their ponies could travel. Now too much timber. Jim Baker, the scout who lived on Snake River, was out with the surveying party and says the Utes started a fire in the timber in 2 different places not far from their camp. I'm not acquainted with any of the Utes, and of course they will not converse with a stranger, but I do know that they were in our vicinity, and when these fires were started in the spring and there had been no hunters around, or we should have known it, because the mining camps are their market for meat. About the quantity of timber and grazing land burned over, I cannot give it in acres, but it is immense. It can only be measured by miles, and at this day it is growing more fierce every day. Nothing can now stop it but a storm of rain or snow. J.B. Donaldson, Superintendent. So there's another topic that we don't hardly know anything about. These documents, actually Paul and Ellen Bonifield sent to me, and you know, I've done a little bit of research into it, but I know the Ute Indians were in the area, and that's a whole nother, there's a lot of history there too. John V, there's another letter in here, and I can't remember where it came from, but it says Farwell supported one of his mining partners, John W. Bell, for White River agent. Both Farwell and Bell believed peace between Indians and the settlers was absolutely necessary. The Hans Peak mining district was too small to defend itself against a serious Indian attack. The mine owners were interested in getting gold out of the ground, not turning Utes into farmers or building a railroad to Salt Lake City. So it's just a lot of cool history there. And Judy was actually telling us a little bit ago before this about the Meeker massacre. So the agent at the time was Nathan Meeker, and I believe Farwell was supporting John W. Bell for that position, is what I'm gathering. And they wanted peace, so it's kind of cool history there too that we haven't dug into a whole lot yet.
So here's the map that we've put together. You can see this is close. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. At the top right corner, you can see the Trail Creek head gate. This is where they tapped into Trail Creek for water. And then they basically just followed the lay of the land to their operation, letting gravity do its thing. So they took it around a couple miles from the head gate. It marks tunnel. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That actually was not an original feature of the ditch. There was a sharp corner at a place called Sand Rock Point, is what we later learned, where they had built wood fluming around, and then wrapped through kind of along the 409 trail that is there now. Along the east side of Farwell Mountain, there's another tunnel. That's the second one that we found a couple years ago. That tunnel was original to the ditch in the 1870s. Outside of that tunnel, the water dropped 300 feet. It's very steep terrain there. It's practically impossible to stand there. So the water fell 300 feet. They built a collection box. They built it out of wood, filled it with sand to catch the water, and then they rerouted it from there. So up to that point was considered the upper level of the ditch. After that tunnel was considered the lower level of the ditch. And then it continues wrapping around the south side of Farwell Mountain into some of the other peaks. The circle where it says String Ridge, we believe this is generally where Farwell's mining operations were, and we're guessing that mainly because if you just look at the topography, there's a real thin strip that sticks out of the ground, and it seems like that would be an appropriate name of what you'd call something like that, String Ridge. So we're assuming that's about where he had his operations. And that's where the ditch originally would have terminated, was that area. When Robert McIntosh took over a few years later, he extended over to the Poverty Bar area. He had a sand pit, a sand box on Little Mountain, and water gathered there, and it fed into pipes going down the mountain, and they blasted away the ground to mine it. So this is a general map of the ditch. If anybody has questions, fire away. Yeah.
So did McIntosh then, he struck some gold?
He did.
Down past where String Ridge is?
Yeah, where it says sandbox above Poverty Bar, it would have been right in that area, which is right outside of present-day Hans Peak Village.
It's actually right almost next to the village.
Yeah.
If you go up to Hans Peak, you can actually go to String, you can go to Poverty Bar.
Yeah.
And see all the tailings and.
Yep, we were in there 2-3 years ago. It's almost like they just packed up and left one day, because you can still walk among all the tailings piles, and it very clearly the mining operation was there.
I just brought it up so that other people might want to go up there and see it.
Yeah, it's right off the highway.
It's right there.
And I read, I think it was in that historic Hans Peak book, I'm not sure, but there was a placer mining operation at Poverty Bar. They had built a dam up where the current Hans Peak Lake is, and ran a ditch around to feed that, but there wasn't enough water to do much of a job of it, and so McIntosh extended the ditch, and it came together with the water from that
That's exactly right.
operation, and it increased the available water that enabled them to run the hydraulic.
That's exactly right. The contractor that built that dam in the ditch from present-day Hans Peak Lake is the same contractor that we'll talk about later that ended up in a lawsuit at an appeals court in Colorado.
I read that he was the engineer, not just a contractor.
His name was William Flick, was the engineer.
Oh, okay.
Was the contractor, yeah. Well, contractor, I'm not sure who the engineer was.
And both ditches landed right here.
Yeah, so the ditch from Hans Peak Lake ended up in that same sandbox on Little Mountain. They fed together into that sandbox, and both waters from both then fed the mining operation.
So originally the Farwell ditch would not have went to the sandbox. It would have been 1 mile shorter. You know, and I don't know exactly where that point is, but McIntosh extended it to here. So,
Any other questions? Okay.
get this to work. So the tunnel. So we hiked this whole stretch right here last year and the year before, and that's 3 miles one way, and it's a pretty brutal hike. It's easy because it's flat, you know, it's not like you're going up, but there's so much, I mean, there's dead trees falling in it, and it's just, you're constantly going up and over trees. David can tell you, David went with us last year, he can tell you what it's like, but I think it took us 5 hours one way. So, but that one stretch we've hiked. We've been to the first tunnel. This section right here is actually a road now. I don't know, I can't remember for sure who, David might know, but they actually just dozed out the ditch and made it a road. So now it's just a perfectly smooth, level trail around that mountain. So yeah, that's kind of what we've done. We hope to, in future years, hike the whole thing. So this is a map that I came across last year. It's from 1911, a topographic map. And it was a pretty fun find because it actually has the ditch on it. In 1911, it was called the Hans Peak Placer Ditch. If I can get this, so it's just blue, but this is where it is right here, and it goes clear up, and that's where it starts. Right here, it actually shows the tunnel, which is called Tunnel Hill. It's what we originally called Tunnel 2 because it was the second one we found, but it was the first tunnel built. But it comes around here and basically ends up almost exactly how David originally had it laid out. So it was pretty incredible just to, you know, we always thought that's where it was, but now we have proof that that's exactly how it was originally built. So the architecture of the ditch, it was, like we said, 17 miles long, hand dug, that fell at a gentle downhill gradient of 32 feet per mile, roughly. I'm not 100% on that number, but that'd be pretty close. Too steep of a grade would cause the water to wash out the ditch, which they did have problems with water washing it out in places. They had to, it was a constant battle to keep it operational. They were, in some places it would, you know, the mountainside would cave in and fill it up. They'd have to dig it out. And, you know, some places it would wash out the side of it and they'd have to repair it. So that grade was pretty crucial to have that correct. Navigated through the mountain terrain from Trail Creek to the sandbox above Poverty Bar. It was comprised of head gates, miles of wooden flumes, 2 tunnels. It was originally 1, which actually, in this court case, we learned there was actually a 3rd tunnel. It was a short tunnel. We haven't located that one yet, though. Rock work, so there was, you know, when we say rock work, it was not a tunnel, but not far off from it. They basically made a ditch right through rock. It just is open on top.
We'll have pictures of that.
Yeah,
too.
we'll have some pictures there. And then blast gates and piping. The ditch was 6 foot wide at the top, 3.5 foot wide at the bottom, and 3.5 foot tall. And there's still, today there's parts of the ditch that have been, you know, completely wiped out. But there's a lot of it that is still, it's been preserved, and, you know, it's not, I'd say it's still pretty close to those dimensions. It's just right there, plain as day. So the tunnels at Sand Rock Point and Tunnel Hill. So Tunnel Hill was the first one built. Joe Lucene was a contractor that made a bet. He would meet his partner in the middle of Tunnel Hill and shake his hand within 10 days, which is, you know, something else that I can't quite fathom is how they started on both ends and just nailed it right in the center, because they did that with both tunnels. You know, I can see that with today's technology, but I don't know how they did it back then. There were 60 feet left. Joe made it with 5 minutes to spare, but his partner refused to shake his hand. So there's an article about that somewhere, but it's a pretty cool story if you ever get a chance to read it. So like Nolan was saying, water water fell roughly 300 feet upon the exit of Tunnel Hill. That's something we didn't know until we read this court case that we'll talk about. So when we were at the tunnel last year, me and another guy went up and over, and we're trying to find the ditch on the other side. We couldn't find it anywhere. We looked and looked. Well, we didn't know that the water dropped 300 feet right at the exit. Like Nolan said, a man-made sandbox caught the water. It was built out of 2-inch lumber, and then it diverted it back into the ditch. We've also talked about the sandbox above Poverty Bar where the ditches came together. They needed a kind of a holding, I'll call it a holding pond. The water came in there, built up, and then they had some gates, and then they had piping that went down the mountain. They needed to have that elevation drop to get pressure with the water. And that's how they were able to operate what they call the giants, which is basically just blasted away the mountainside with water.
So, William Flick case, back in February, Rod and I made a trip out to Denver, and actually ended up here as well, just to do some research. We went to the state archives in Denver, which was a ton of information there, going through the old journals and ledgers of the actual history of Colorado. And the biggest thing we found was this court case. After Robert McIntosh sold off the ditch, he sold to a company called the Hans Peak and Elk River Canal and Placer Mining Company. This was in the 1890s. This company hired a gentleman named William Flick basically to renovate the ditch, make it bigger, better, flow more water. Had William Flick been successful, we never would have learned a lot of what we learned because there would have been no court case. But William Flick agreed to supply a certain amount of water, maybe it's in here.
Well, it was basically in August, upon completion, it was supposed to run the ditch was supposed to run full for a period of 30 days, and that failed to happen, which is why there was a court case, which, that late in the summer, I don't know how it would have happened anyway, but that's what he agreed to.
It sounds like he agreed to something that was impossible, but he agreed to do it, and got taken to court for it. So he was hired to basically renovate the ditch. The main projects of that were cleaning it out, fills up over time with sediment and whatnot, and enlarging it so that, like he mentioned before, 6 feet wide at the top, 3.5 at the bottom, 3.5 tall. Ways Gulch, which is towards the end of the ditch, down some of the lower elevation of the ditch. Build new flume to span that rather than wrap around. Extend the ditch so that it would correctly extend the lower level of the ditch so that it would correctly catch water out of the Tunnel Hill Tunnel. Above Tunnel Hill, there was sections of the ditch that were leaking lots of water. So he blasted new sections through solid rock, with what pictures of, to correct that. Where did I leave off there? Rebuilding the dam on the head gate at the beginning on Trail Creek, and I think that was just to strengthen it and enlarge the opening in the head gate to supply more water.
One other thing was he was supposed to build a new flume around Sandrock Point. I don't know if you mentioned that or not.
I skipped that one.
So originally there was fluming around Sandrock Point, which is the location of one of the tunnels now. And part of his contract was he was supposed to rebuild those flumes. Ended up being a lot of controversy, but they decided to build a second tunnel the last second. And there was some argument going back and forth between him and the engineer that this company hired and the president of this company. The president wasn't there at the time they made this decision, but the people who were there agreed it was a much better solution to build a tunnel.
So they had flumes wrapping around it, and it's called Sandrock Point because the rock is sandy, and it had just a tendency to fall away and break away, and they'd have to rebuild the flumes. And so originally it was built more permanent type of flume, stronger, more durable, that will last. Well, then they came to the decision tunnel's going to be a better solution.
Which,
and that's-
I mean, it's still there today in almost perfect condition, so.
Probably head to the next slide. So all work was supposed to be completed by August 15th, 1897. That's 3 days off from exactly 125 years ago today. Yeah, here's where I missed earlier. He guaranteed upon completion a full head of water would flow through the ditch for 30 days. It's late in the summer, Trail Creek, the water level was down. It wasn't supplying the water that it probably had earlier in the summer, and he was not able to supply the water he said he would. So he ended up in court. Multiple times in the document, it mentions a third small tunnel near Beaver Creek. We wanted to try to find that someday. We haven't yet, if it still exists. It also talked about near the head of the ditch, building 3 reservoirs to hold water that they could release when Trail Creek was lower. They staked them out, but those were never actually built. And I'm not sure exactly where they would have been. Yeah, so they determined the new flume, the permanent flume was not a good idea. It would never be permanent because the mountain itself was not permanent. It's just the type of rock it was. Springy, sandy rock slides were happening. So instead they decided to bore right through and build a tunnel. William Flick charged $7 per foot of tunnel. Work started July 28th, 1897. 12 men working around the clock. A few days they took off when they ran out of powder. The tunnel itself, in general, 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall. It's roughly 170 feet long. Had they built the flumes instead, it would have been 250 feet flumes to wrap around rather than going through. And then in the court case, under testimony, William Flick said, some days the best the best progress they could make would be a foot, other days 4 feet, just depended on the day. Each end of the tunnel had somebody drilling holes. They would drill 10 holes a day, put their dynamite in, and blast it, and then take the rock out. Tunnel was completed August 22nd, 1897, for only 26 days, which kind of blows our mind. I suppose that one went faster because the rock was easier to work with than the rock at the other tunnel. So we'll get into some pictures here. This is the Sandrock Point Tunnel where water would have flowed into it. This is the one we just talked about from the court case, built in the 1890s. This one's about 170 feet long.
Is it built in a curve? Is there a curve in it?
The tunnel itself is straight or narrow.
Oh.
Here our good friend David Zahner, when he took us up there in 2019, I believe he was marking GPS coordinates with the device he was holding. But that's also, that's the other end of the tunnel, that's the exit side. And when we hike to it, you come to the exit first from the way we got to it. So we got to the outlet side of the tunnel. That's what you see there. You can see at the bottom there still is some lumber there, which we assume is they tied into some fluming at that point, and the wood's still just laying there.
Right on the exit of this tunnel, the ditch would have curved to the right. And this was a location it mentions in the court case multiple times that the mountainside just kept caving in time and time, and they basically were constantly trying to fix it. So they eventually built, I believe they called it fluming. They just restructured it with wood to try to keep it from happening. So we're assuming, like Nolan said, that lumber is part of, one time of flume that would have wrapped around and tied into this structure that they built. You can't hardly see it, but in there, somebody has carved in "no admittance." We don't know if that was back in the day, or I don't think hardly anybody's ever seen this tunnel in the past 100 years or whatever. So I don't know who put that there, but might be original. I don't know. So yeah, this is another picture of the remains of what we think was the fluming at the exit of the tunnel. So this is a section of the ditch. Earlier I kind of showed the 3 mile part that we hiked. This is on that. This is part of that. and you can, I don't know how well you can see it, but there's actually still water that sits in the ditch to this day, right in this area. These are just a couple pictures of a ditch that is actually pretty clear. These sections don't last very long. It's most of it, like I said, there's trees down everywhere that you have to climb over, but you can see it pretty easy in these two pictures. So here's what we were talking about, the rock work above Tunnel Hill. This would not have been original. This is part of it that William Flick would have built. And it, you know, to me, it's almost just as incredible as the tunnels, because this goes on for, I think there's at least three different sections like this, and they're pretty long. And you know, you can see, you know, on the edges here, you know, that's all. If you're there, it's, you know, the bank is pretty big, and it's just incredible. They moved almost all that rock by hand.
You can kind of get the scale of it on that picture on the right. We're picture people hiking through it. So some of that rock is this tall.
And then on this one, you can see all the rock that had to be moved after they blasted it out. And you know, to blast that out, they had to, you know, they drilled by hand. You know, they had one guy turning, and I think one guy hitting it with a sledgehammer or hammer or something, and you know, they just did it all day long. So that's another real good, well-preserved section of the ditch there.
So this is the Tunnel Hill tunnel that we located a couple years ago. That's Rodney and I with our wives in the picture on the right. The tunnel itself is similar in structure to the other one. It's 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall on average. This one, the outlet side is collapsed, so you're not able to go through this one, but it's probably probably a little shorter than the other one, 120, 150 feet, but still just very impressive to see. Very, very similar in nature to the other tunnel. This is out on kind of the southeast corner of the Farwell Mountain area.
And sometime, if you ever get a chance to read this court case, we have a PDF of it. We got it out of the Colorado State Archives, and we had the original. Some of it was handwritten, I think, even just the original court documents. But we got copies scanned, and so we have a PDF of it. But he has described not this tunnel, but the tunnel he built, detailed down to how many pounds of powder they put in each hole, and you know, just very detailed information of how it was built. And like Nolan said, had he been successful, we never would have known it. So
this would have been the tunnel where the handshake bet was made. Farther down the ditch, this is kind of on the west side of Farwell Mountain, down a little valley. David Zahner pointed this out to us 3 years ago when he took us out. It's an old cabin near the ditch. The assumption is that some type of ditch maintainer would have lived there and operated out of there just to maintain the ditch and make sure it kept flowing and make repairs as needed. Obviously, it's seen better days, but it's still there.
So this is what they called the sandbox above Poverty Bar. It's kind of hard to see it in this picture. I hiked up with two of my older boys a couple of years ago, and it's steep to get up there. But this area here, it's overgrown now, but that's where the water came in. I don't know if I have pictures of it. I don't think I do in this presentation, but you can see the ditch coming in on one side, and then the other ditch that was built later that also came into this point. These photos, I think, came from maybe the Try to Pioneers Museum. And this was actually some of the fluming that was built. We're not exactly sure where these were located on the ditch, but still pretty interesting to see.
I think Arianti found these photos.
It's from the Treads collection.
Okay.
This is not Farwell Ditch, but this is an example of what the fluming would have looked like around Sandrock Point. You know, somewhere we read how they did it. I think they had some cables that they lowered down, maybe platforms, and the men would work off of those platforms. But pretty incredible what they could do to support that fluming.
Some of that is still there today. I don't know where Montrose, Colorado is, but some of that's still there today. I've seen current pictures.
Only 5 hours away.
Okay. I think this is a short video if it loads. This is just a video of us hiking last year, just so you can kind of get a visual on what it's like when trying to get through this stuff.
It started raining on us.
So that's the ditch right there. And so that thick forest is what you're kind of trying to get through the whole time.
And then, kind of getting towards the end of this, like we mentioned earlier, back in March, we were able to get Routt County to designate the Farwell Ditch as a local historic landmark monument. What's the correct term, Arianti?
A historic site. Property.
That's a good word. A lot of work went into that. That actually started years ago with, I know David and Judy had put some effort into that. Rodney and I came along, maybe it was fate, we don't know how it all worked out, but they passed along all of their knowledge to us, and we've kind of taken the baton and we've learned a lot, shared with them. Do you have a question?
What does that mean? I mean, so,
Well,
Yeah, I'll let you
if don't
answer.
mind,
Yeah.
To be designated on the Routt County Historic Register means that it has significance, it's important to the history of Routt County, and it has integrity, which means that when you go there, you can see what the ditch looked like at the time, and you get a sense of the history of that place. And of course, the whole Farwell Ditch, as you've heard already today, is an important part of Routt County's story. The Routt County Historic Register is honorary, not regulatory. So what that means is that it puts its place in history, the information is on the historic record, it's publicly available, but it does not limit what happens to the ditch. So somebody, and that won't happen in this case, but there are properties on the historic register that if somebody changes it so it doesn't look like it did historically, that property could be removed. But it's a way to celebrate the history. Jay has a historic barn on the Routt County Historic Register. This building is on the Routt County Historic Register, and it's a way of celebrating and making accessible the history. There are other historic registers, like the Steamboat Springs Register, that does put some protections in place. But the Routt County Register and the National Register are strictly honorary. So it's important, but it also makes the property eligible to apply for grants to do historic work. That's also important. So you should say who owns the ditch.
We should. The vast majority of the ditch today falls on National Forest land, Routt National Forest. It crosses one piece of privately owned property. It's a Warhorse LLC, I think. It's an entity.
It's a mining claim.
A local guy here in town owns it. We've gotten to know him. As soon as we found out who owned it, Rodney called him and explained who we were, what we were trying to do. Immediately, he was on board, totally supportive of preserving the history. As we've gotten to know him, he's on board with this and has been very supportive. But yeah, by and large, it falls on national forest land.
And one more thing,
Yeah.
and that is that the Forest Service is totally supportive and excited about this historic designation and the work that you have done. And they want their archaeologists to come out and do a more rigorous survey of the ditch because it belongs, in their estimation, on the National Historic Register. So this is a big deal.
Yeah, we'll talk more on that in a little bit.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, does currently, like in the spring or after a big rain, does much of that ditch still have the channel that pulls the water down?
Sections will hold water, but it won't flow. I mean, I think you'd agree with that.
Right.
It's and this is 150 years old. I think the last time it was used was early 1900s, and so over 100 years since it's been used, it just falls in disarray and doesn't.
There must be some vegetation that shows where it's. Has a drone been flown over it?
I'd like to. I've tried to talk my son into buying it.
You can actually get on Google Earth and see a lot of it.
Yeah, sections of it you can see, from Google Earth or other mapping websites. Sections that go through thick forest, you lose the line a little bit, but if it's a topography map and you have elevation, sometimes you can follow it around the mountain and pick it up later if you're looking for it.
And any trace of the metal that was in the sawmill, potential?
Not that we're aware of.
Not that we know of. The only metal we know of would be in the Hans Peak Historical Society Museum. I think there's some metal valves and piping maybe that John V had brought in. But the sawmill, I don't think.
You don't have the location of it.
I'm not sure. There, in that historic Hans Peak book, there was a map that had been drawn in the back of that book. I can't remember if it showed the location of the sawmill, but it did show the location of International Camp. It's interesting to look at. So yeah, what's next for us? More hiking and discovery would be number one for us. So we didn't get to we did a little bit of it on this trip. We mentioned the local gentleman that owns a small section of property that the ditch crosses. 2 days ago we were able to, he showed us around his property and we were able to hike about between a quarter or half mile of it. But we weren't able to do a lot of it on this trip, so we'll be coming back for sure next year. We hope to do a lot more. Every time we hike it, we mark a GPS track so we can get an accurate location on it. So our goal is to do the whole ditch. There's places where it's kind of completely wiped out, and it might be kind of hard to do that. But I think if we, like he said, follow the elevation, we'll be able to pick it back up. Our goal is to get it on the National Register of Historic Places. There's actually two different national designations. The first one is Register of Historic Places. The second one is an actual national landmark, if I understand it right. And that one is, I don't know if that would ever happen on this ditch or not. It takes a lot for that to happen.
We feel confident that the National Register is possible. The local Forest Service officials have been very supportive. They believe it deserves a spot on that list. It's just a process. It's an application and a process to go through, and we haven't started that yet, but we plan to put it on that list one day.
We would love someday to turn this into an interpretive walking or biking trail. You can't really make it a motorized trail without destroying it. So if we could have interpretive signs explaining some of the history, or like at the Sand Rock Point Tunnel, some of the information from William Flick of how he built it. that would be a goal of ours, and hopefully someday we can make that happen, working with the Forest Service. 150th anniversary of completion is in 2027, so that's not too far off. So yeah, just kind of wraps it up for us. I want to thank Hans Peak Area Historical Society, David and Judy Zahner, Marge Erdley, Historic Routt County, Routt National Forest, James Klaus, who's the owner of that small section of the ditch, and Katie Adams and Tread Pioneers. So thank you all. Judy, do you want to speak a little
You
bit?
know, you've done such a wonderful job, I don't think I can add a thing.
I don't know about that.
They did a wonderful presentation.